race. Do you see this, my brothers and sisters? So this is when different classifications regarding the human skulls commenced. Listen. Thank you, my Father, my King, for your wisdom. Listen. His classification set up a color line to the detriment of later generations. Mr. Blumenbach classified 5 chief races of mankind: the Caucasian, the Mongolian, the Ethiopian, the American Indians, and Malayan. Moreover, he considered the Caucasian to be the original race. Thank you, my Father, my King. And so what we learned is that even Dr. Rudolph R. Windsor, even he himself, did not teach that Europeans were not fully human. So we can go into even sources that are used by even the Hebrew Israelites, who acknowledge, many of them acknowledge this source. And we can see what Dr. Rudolph R. Windsor, what he spoke about. Do you see this, my brothers and sisters? Very excellent read for those of you who have it in your private library. Now, another source that we need to look at. See, one thing about our Father and our King is, our Father and our King is going to let us see both sides. Balanced scales, just weights, just like it talks about in the scriptures. So now we're going to go to another source, which is from a European gentleman. His name is Arthur Talmai Abernethy. And he did a work called The Jew, a Negro. And so for those of you who may have an issue, this is what Mr. Arthur Talmai Abernethy, PhD, this is what he looked like. And the name of the book is The Jew, a Negro, being a study of the Jewish ancestry from an impartial standpoint. Do you see this? In other words, it's not biased. So here we have a European man who did great work pertaining to the study regarding the Jew, a Negro. And here's his timeline when he lived. Do you see this, my brothers and sisters? And it was originally published in 1910. Let's listen what this gentleman has to say regarding this. I'm reading from, thank you so much, my Father, my King, for your wisdom. I'm going to be reading on page 11, and I'm going to be reading from the chapter that is entitled Origin of Man and the Flood. Let's read. He says, before setting aside the subject of the creation of man, let us take some notice of the opinion of those who think that mankind was in being before Adam, who was the progenitor of the Jews only. To support this, they allege that Moses makes mention of 2 distinct creations, one of mankind in general and the other of Adam and Eve. And he gives the references, Genesis 1:27 and again Genesis 2:7. Listen. And in the progress of his history, gives strong imitations. Excuse me, thank you, Father King, for the correction. It says, and in the progress of his history, gives strong intimations that there were several more men in the world when they were created. Else it is not easily to be conceived how Cain could be a tiller of the ground, which must presuppose all the artificers that have a relation to tillage, nor what reason he had to apprehend that everyone who found him would slay him. Nor can his going into another country, marrying a wife, and building a city be otherwise accounted for, from which they would infer that Moses intended only to give an account of the origin of the Jews and not of the primitive parents of the whole human race. So what's interesting is that as far as the gentleman, author, Talmai Abernethy, he also had to deal with the same things that was going on with the scientists and what they were saying regarding the race. See, it was a misunderstanding regarding to the scriptures. And this gentleman, when he lived, he actually wrote about it. Listen, these objections are easily answered. For the passage wherein the creation of man is mentioned, a second time is plainly no more than a recapitulation of what had been said before of the creation of the world in general, with a more particular detail of that of our first parents. That's powerful. Do you see this, my brothers and sisters? See, there was a misunderstanding. Listen. And as to the numbers of men supposed to be in the world about the time of the murder of Abel, it is by no means improbable that these should be descendants of Adam and Eve, whose posterity in the space of near 130 years, for it was in that year of Adam's age that Seth, who was given in lieu of Abel, was born, might by a fair calculation be multiplied to many thousand souls, considering the primitive fecundity, and that none is supposed to have died in the interim. That's powerful. Regarding the age of Adam and his children's. Listen, but the most plausible objection to the pre-Adamites is that if Adam and Eve be allowed to be the progenitors of all mankind, there can be no tolerable cause a sign of the difference in color between the whites and blacks, it being very improbable that they were the offspring of the same parents. This was written by a European gentleman on his unbiased study pertaining to the Jew, a Negro. You see this, my brothers and sisters? That's powerful. And for those of you who basically would like to get the source, then you could be able to get that for your learning. Do you see this, my friend? Very interesting. Another source that we need to look at is very powerful. And it's called, this is by Mr. J. Joel Augustus Rogers. And the name of this book is called Nature Knows No Color Line. This is another source that many of those who are Hebrew Israelites really like to use. Do you understand, my family? Do you see this? Again, nature knows no color line. And this was the gentleman, Mr. J.A. Rogers. And this man did an excellent study. He was a scholar. And basically, this is what he looked like. He was born in Jamaica. Do you see this? And this is what he looked like. Very interesting read. He also read many books and done his history very well. And this is a little bit of information about him that you can look and do your research. Do you see this, my family? Excellent scholar. And a man who also did research on an unbiased point of view. Let's look at the little interesting things about him on the back. And look at some of the things he believed. Classic work of black study refuting scientific racism. In Nature Knows No Color Line, originally published in 1952, historian Joel Augustus Rogers examines the origins of racial hierarchy and the color problem. Rogers was a humanist who believed that there were no scientifically evident racial divisions. All humans belong to one race. That's powerful. Do you see this? And this is the rest of his beliefs that as you pause the video, you can read for yourself. So our Father, our King is letting you see the fact that this gentleman stood against racism and stood against what the scientists were saying. See, a lot of people are not informed of this, that there were men who actually understood what the scientists were saying, and they was doing their work, putting work in, refuting what those scientists were saying. Do you see this? Thank you, my Father, King. I'm going to be reading from chapter 2. And it's entitled Color Prejudice Among Whites and Among Darker Peoples for Their Own Kind. And I'm going to be reading on page 21. And let's look at something interesting, what Mr. Rogers had to state in his record. He says the next most important work on the theory of plural origins was the Preadamate by Isaac de la Perrier, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in 1655. Perrier proved his from the Bible. So you had this gentleman here, Mr. Isaac de la Perrier. In 1655, he concluded that they were preadamates. Do you see this? In 1655, Isaac de la Perrier concluded this. Let's listen. Composing chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, he showed very logically there were two creations of man. Chapter 1 records a man and woman who were given dominion over the earth and over every living thing. Chapter 2 says there was not a man to till the ground. So God made a man out of dust of the earth and later gave him a woman as companion in the Garden of Eden. This man is mentioned as Adam and the woman Eve. Perrier says that the man and the woman in chapter 1 were therefore preadamates. Do you see this? And that it was from that stock Cain got his wife. See, these arguments go back years ago. Do you understand? Listen, the Bible clearly says that Cain was sent off to another country. And how could he have got a wife there if there were then on earth only three persons, Adam, Eve, and Cain? So this was the argument that Perrier said. Listen, Adam and Eve said, Perrier, were consecrated exclusively by God to be ancestors of his chosen people, the Jews. The same thing that author Tal McGee Abernathy was speaking of. Do you see this? You see the connection? Listen, this idea in naming the Jews as the object of a special creation was said to be so flattering to them that Perrier, who was a Protestant, was accused of wanting to be their leader. Listen to this. Pope Alexander VIII thought this rank heresy and had him thrown into a dungeon at Versailles. However, thanks to the intervention of Prince de Condé, the book, not himself, was burned. Prostrating himself before the Pope the following year, he abjured, listen to this, he abjured his doctrine. So interesting that Lapierre submitted to the Pope during his time. Do you see this? And his book was burnt instead of him. And he basically gave up his conclusion, what he was teaching. Do you see this? Now listen to this. It was otherwise in the colonies. Racial. Listen to what he says. It says, it was otherwise in the colonies. Racial heresies took root freely and were even preached from Christian pulpits. Do you see this? This is powerful. As far as modern day, the word Christian, very interesting, isn't it? Listen, in the Anglo-Saxon colonies, the blacks were called pre-Adamites. That is offsprings of Cain and Ham. The Catholics still taught a common origin of all men, but in time accepted the Ham legend and of Noah's curse on blacks. That's powerful. See, our Father, our King is taking us back into history, taking us back in time, seeing what was taught, seeing the issues, how even those of European ancestries during that time even start to say that those of black race was pre-Adamites. That's powerful. But see, our Father, our King is going to free us of these misunderstandings. You see this, my family. Thank you so much, my Father, my King, for your wisdom. Now, we're going to go into one of our ancestors. Let's go to one of our ancestors. Our Father, King blessed me with this particular King James version, a very old version that was given to me by family members. Very, very powerful as far as a heritage version is concerned, the King James. And we're going to look at something interesting from one of our ancestors. And many of you may know of this gentleman Name is Frederick Douglass. He was an abolitionist, orator, and a journalist. And here's his information when he was born, and as far as in Maryland. And you can pause that and you can read that. But I want to quote what he said. And what I'm going to quote from is from Life and Times of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass, published by Park Publishing Company in 1882. Mind you the time frame now, when scientists begin to teach the Neanderthal. Listen what our ancestor Frederick Douglass had to say about this particular European individual that he knew. Listen, he says, I was not more, and I quote, he says, I was not more than 13 years old when in my loneliness and destitution, I longed for someone to whom I could go as to a father and protector. The preaching of a white Methodist minister named Hanson was the means of causing me to feel that and it says here, in God, I had such a friend. He thought that all men, great and small, bond and free, were sinners in the sight of God, that they were by nature rebels against his government, and that they must repent of their sin and be reconciled to God through Christ. That's powerful. So regardless of the fact that this man was a Methodist, notice what Frederick Douglass is acknowledging, that his ancestry, that he was white, his name is Hanson, and what he was thinking regarding to all men. Hanson didn't teach Frederick Douglass that he was a superior race or he was from a different stock of humans. But based on what is quoted from him, and you all can read this, I'm going to scroll it down so you can pause and read the rest of what he was saying. Do you see this? Because I don't want to misquote Frederick Douglass. So you can look at that and see what our ancestor had said during that time. Do you understand? Thank you, my Father, my King. Now, let's go back into the scriptures. And let's go to, thank you so much, Father, my King. Let's go to Acts, the 10th chapter. Acts, the 10th chapter. I'm going to go to where Kaffa was dealing with Cornelius. Many of you are familiar with this. I want to focus on something interesting. Because a lot of people would say that, well, some people come to a conclusion that Cornelius was a Hebrew Israelite. But amazing how Kaffa received the dream regarding the sheet with the different animals. Do you see this? So we can see a differentiation between what those animals represented. Do you understand? Now, let's go to the book of Acts. Let our Father King guide us. And let's go back and really look at this. I want to show you something as our Father King leads so we all can be edified. And this is when Kaffa is coming to Cornelius' home. Let's look at something interesting. Acts chapter 10. And let us commence at the 24th verse. Let's go to the 23rd verse. Thank you, Father King. It says, Then called he them in and lodged them. And on the morrow, Kaffa went away with them, and certain brothers from Joppa accompanied him. So we have Kaffa going to meet up with Cornelius. Listen, verse 24. And the morrow, after they enter into Caesarea, and Cornelius waited for them and had called together his kinsmen and near friends. And as Kaffa, it says Peter, meaning Kaffa, and as Kaffa was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshiped him. Let's stop for a moment. So here we have, now there's nothing in the Torah. Thank you so much, my Father, my King. There's nothing in the Torah where it's commanded as far as a Hebrew Israelite should mistreat another Hebrew Israelite or degrade them. Do you see this? Do you understand? So here we have, as far as Cornelius showing humility, he actually basically fell at his feet. Now listen what Kaffa does. Verse 26. But Kaffa took him up, saying, stand up. I myself also am a man. That's powerful. Notice how he didn't degrade Cornelius or make him feel like he was an inferior race. You see this, my family? And as he talked with him, he went in and found many that were come together. Notice how Cornelius, going back up, notice how he got his kinsmen and his near friends. Do you see this? Do you understand? Notice the difference between his kinsmen and his friends. They were all expecting Kaffa to come. Now, let's stay in this chapter, and let's just go down to verse 34. Let's see what Kaffa says. Then Kaffa opened his mouth and said, of a truth I perceive. Listen, the Almighty, listen to this. Of truth I perceive. The Almighty is no respecter of persons, but in every nation, he that fears him and work righteousness is accepted with him. That's powerful. That's powerful, my family. Do you see this? This is what Kaffa, what he said. You understand? Now, let's go to 1 Corinthians. Let's go to 1 Corinthians. Let's look at what Shaul had to teach about as far as to give us a little insight on the origins of as far as man. Thank you so much, Father, my King. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And let's look at, start at verse 45. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Start at 45. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. The last Adam was made a quickening spirit. Now let's stop for a moment. Did the apostle take us back to a pre-Adamic or a pre-Adamic race? Who did Apostle Shaul say was the first man? Was it not Adam? You see this? Listen. Howbeit that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterward that which is spiritual. The first man is of the earthy. The second man is the master from heaven. So Shaul is acknowledging Adam. He's acknowledging the creation. He's differentiation between the natural and spiritual. He's also speaking of the master. Listen. As is the earthy, or the earthly, such are they that are earthly. And as is the heavenly, such are they also that are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of the earthly, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly. That's power. So Shaul was dealing with not only the natural part of man, but the spiritual part. Not only was he dealing with Adam, he dealt with our master, the king. Do you understand, my brothers and sisters? Let's go to Titus, or Titus. Let's go to Titus. Thank you so much, my Father, my King, for who you are. Titus, the 3rd chapter. And let's start at verse 8. And it reads, this is a faithful saying, and these things I will that you affirm constantly, that they which have believed in the Almighty might be careful to maintain good works. These things are good and profitable unto men. But avoid foolish questions and genealogies and contentions and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and vain. See, Shaul is getting us to focus on what is profitable. And notice how he identifies the things that are not profitable. Listen. Verse 10. A man that is an heretic, after the first and second admonished, reject, knowing that he that is such is subverted and sins, being condemned of himself. So there is a grace period. Do Do you see this, my family? But Shaul was very serious when it came to these things. You understand, my brothers and sisters? Now, let's go to a little history before we end, before I find a king crystallize these things. We're going to go to, again, a dictionary of early Christian beliefs. And I want to just show you something interesting. I'm going to be reading from page 551. And the topic is dealing with races of men, races of man. And here are which we actually just read not too long ago. Here are the verses, which we actually read earlier. And let's look at something interesting. And this is from Aristides. He says, there are 4 classes of men in this world: barbarians, Greeks, Jews, and it has here Christians and Christians. And this was by Aristides in 125. This is way before the Council of Nicaea now. 125 AD, Eastern Writer, volume 9, page 264. There's sometimes where we can have a problem with this, and I understand, by all means, I understand when, people have an issue with this because of modern day, I understand. But notice how it's distinguished from the Greeks. Do you see this? Meaning anointed one. This is what we have to understand. Listen, my family. Here's another one. At the same time, it teaches us not to wrong anyone belonging to another race and to bring him under the yoke. For there is no other reason to justify such a thing than difference of race. But that is no reason at all. And this is from Clement of Alexandria, 195 AD, Eastern Writer, volume 2, page 368. And here's one more. We admit that the same nature exists in every race and the same virtue. And this is, again, of Clement of Alexandria, 195 AD, Eastern Writer, volume 2, page 419. Do you see this? So in history, what we see is that even the Europeans refuted those of the same race who tried to say that they were different. And so I think I find our king for this teaching. Are Europeans fully human? Absolutely. Yes, there are things that scientists have done to try to manipulate creation. But as far as the scriptures and the ancient records, and even history affirms this. I love all of you. In the name of our Father and our King, Maranatha. Amen.